2024, everyone, is talking about this super election year on steroids. When you observe, let's say, disinformation fields in Western democracy, be it Europe, be it US, where do you see stories and narratives and trends overlapping?
I think context is important. The elections that we're having this year are the largest since the advent of the internet. The most countries, the most people will be voting this year of any time since the internet was invented. That means that the issues that we'll face, the issues that will emerge, will be historic. And there are a variety of them, but context is important, right? The first is the way in which people are accessing their information is changing. There are more social platforms and more availability of different kind of streams of information than there's ever been before, which just means that the places people get their information are changing, right? It's not just Meta, it's not just Google anymore. There are a lot of varieties of platforms that are much smaller that might not have the same rules or sophistication of their systems in place, which create opportunities for mis and disinformation to spread faster. We also know that there are new technologies like generative AI and others that create new possibilities to spread that sort of mis and disinformation faster. And we know that it's not just coming from coordinated and authentic behavior campaigns from foreign governments, but it's also being spread from within a country, which makes it much more challenging to address these risks than we've seen before. Now, the sort of trends that we're seeing around the world, there are going to be a large number of coordinated attempts to influence elections from foreign sources and domestic sources. There are incentives, I think, across the board for people to try to meddle in the outcome of an election. And what we've learned in the last 4 years is that there's a lot of ways to do that and be quite successful if you're skilled at it, which means that the 2024 elections are quite vulnerable.
How do you explain? We know that people believed lies before. We had Holocaust based on lies. But how come that you now have conspiracies as legitimate truth or world that people act upon and vote upon?
I think people are not more willing to believe lies and false information than they've ever been. I think they're just more exposed to false information than they've ever been. However, there are some new caveats to that. One is that the spread of realistic, deceptive content, like deepfakes, means that people are less willing to trust authoritative, factual information. We call this the liar's dividend. It's when the spread of people's understanding that any content could or could not be authoritative and factual means that actual factual information is less believable as well. That's a new problem, but it's part of the same problem, which is that there's been a long-standing attempt to call into question the veracity of authoritative sources in order to benefit a politician of any variety, to withstand scandals or to make claims that that someone is out to get them, etc. There's just new tools now that that aid in that process more than ever.
But some say that U.S. is different because here you're allowed to carry guns. So if someone is working on this kind of campaigns online, bad things can happen, faster and with worse consequences. Am I right?
There's always a risk of political violence in an election if polarization escalates. We've seen it in a lot of countries that aren't the United States, right? There's been a number of incidents of political violence, including most recently in Brazil after their most recent presidential election. More so than I think the availability of weapons is the willingness of concerted actors to seek to further polarize an electorate for a political gain.
From within the US, what do you detect? Is it possible, what you say, at all to detect some organized misinformation actors?
Yes, and we've learned over the last decade that the social media platforms, in concert with national intelligence agencies and a variety of other resources, have become quite skilled at detecting when coordinated and authentic behavior is taking place. It can become increasingly difficult to do those things because some of the ways that we've created systems to detect those behaviors are being constantly tested by bad actors seeking to evade those detections, right? So it's always a game of cat and mouse. That said, I think really the concern around elections is how quickly you can detect them. I think it is very likely that there will be a large number of attempts to influence elections. And the key is how prepared are election officials to combat that? How prepared is the electorate to fact check information? How willing are people to trust in the outcome of an election being authoritative? And so long as those things are done through pre-bunking and journalism holding people accountable, I think there's a good chance that we can improve trust in elections, but it'll take a concerted effort.
But what do we do if the richest man in the world, the owner of X, says that we are scum and we are not needed as journalists?
Look, I think it's important to hold people to account, whether they're politicians or those in charge of major platforms. Everyone needs to be held to account. And one of the ways we do that is through regulation. In the United States and around the world, regulations to hold platforms accountable so that they aren't able to spread lies and mis and disinformation, so that they're held accountable for violating local policy and regulation is really important. And regardless of who owns these companies, it is in all of our best interest to make sure that we are fact-checking our information, using authoritative information sources, and distributing that information as best we can to those in our orbit, to our friends and families.
Are we late in this regulation because we saw what societal impact social networks had since 2016 until now?
It's been a long road to regulate social platforms, but I think there's a lot of areas of the world, the EU especially, that are moving in a good direction, right? The Digital Services Act makes great inroads here. The recently announced EU Commission's regulation on the transparency of targeting of political advertisements is a great step forward. These things make a difference.
What is CDT working on?
The main focus of our work this year is how to effectively prevent the spread of mis and disinformation online through the variety of places where it's created, using tools like generative AI, and the ways where it's distributed, especially on social platforms. Now, it's one thing to observe the problem, but I think we can't stop to wait for legislation. The elections this year are coming too fast and too frequently, and legislation is honestly slow. There are a number of ways where I think election officials, the social media and generative AI companies themselves, and other stakeholders can take action to do immediate good for protecting elections. Now, for the companies, I think the first thing is to develop good policies to protect elections, and that means a variety of things. It means boosting authoritative information through voting information centers. But it also means making sure that your tools don't allow the generation of harmful content like deepfakes or deceptive AI content that does things like tell people incorrect information about the time, manner, or dates of voting. But it also means creating preventions on the spread of mis and disinformation, things like break the glass measures that turn off the virality of posts if they go too viral too quickly and are about political subjects, right? There are tools that can be employed to prevent this content from spreading quickly. Separate from the companies themselves, election officials themselves are a really important stakeholder. In the United States, that means very local level. In other countries, oftentimes there's a centralized election administration body for the whole country, which is definitely a benefit because it's much easier to regulate across the board. For election officials, I think an important thing to do is to make sure that you are authenticating the content that you're producing so that it can't be deep faked, right? Copies of ballots can't be made to look like they show a different winner if they include a watermark, for instance. You can also secure your, there's important steps to take to secure yourself online by protecting your website from hacking, to protect yourself against harassment and intimidation. And there are tools that many of the companies have developed to help election officials get their information out to voters. Now, all of those are important things, and they're things that CDT is working on this year.
How our electorate, our citizens who are scared and who don't trust traditional institutions, are able to grasp this at all, because we know that cognitive dissonance is playing on steroids out there. So what can we do if everyone has their own truth and they know what's going on? They don't need someone to tell them that they've been influenced.
Right. Well, the first problem is polarization. I think the first step in preventing people from disbelieving truth is to be inoculated against the possibility of lies, which means forcefully communicating facts to your viewers. I think that the media has a really important place in this, right? Fact-checking politicians, holding platforms to account for spreading mis and disinformation. There's that. But I think in addition to that, there's the question of how do individuals hold themselves accountable? And a lot of that relies on their ability to fact check things, right? So part of that means looking up content to verify its authenticity. Part of that means spreading that information to your networks when you see mis and disinformation spreading on social media. But if someone is dedicated to believing a lie, it's very difficult.
In these difficult times, you have one of your reports, it's from a couple of years ago, talks about bridging this digital divide. We know that Western democracies are aging, and we know that youth as a new generation, as digital natives, have different political trends, and they demand basically also for change in democratic process. The old way of doing things for them is not viable anymore, and they're either getting out of electoral politics in general, which is trend in Europe. Young people just don't vote. I don't know what's the trend in the US. So what can be done to adjust democracy for this kind of environment that you described?
Well, I think there is an emerging gap in how people get their news. Sometimes that's across generations, sometimes that's across demographics, but the key is ensuring that we're trying to bring everyone along in the process. That can mean a lot of different things, but the spread of factual information has to be a key part of it, right? There are a lot of solutions to be said here, but I think step one is ensuring that digital literacy is prominent, that there's opportunities for upskilling and education, and part of it also is meeting people where they are. A lot of new tools, a lot of new technology is emerging that can be overwhelming for older folks or people with disabilities. And a key to that is making sure that there's routes to access those folks, to get them information about these new tools and to teach them how to use it.
And for the end, I want to talk a little bit more about AI. You've mentioned it. It's a challenge, but I think that comparing to times when social networks emerged, people are more aware now of possible risks of using AI. That is my sentiment. Maybe I'm not right, but I think people are more aware now than they were with social networks. They kind of let them be, and now after all of this that happened, they're kind of more concentrated on either regulation or thinking what they can do, especially in this kind of environment. What do you detect? You've mentioned deep fakes, generative AI models, but ahead of World Economic Forum, there was this global risk report that pointed out generative AI misinformation as the key challenge of 2024. What do you detect is going on out there at the moment?
Right. There are a few key risks that we see around generative AI that we're very worried about. The first is the ability to micro-target information to specific demographic groups. So that would mean historically it's very costly to create mis and disinformation campaigns in foreign languages. And in a country like the United States, or in smaller countries with a very diverse diaspora of people who speak different languages, it can be very challenging to try to intentionally spread disinformation to language minority groups. The thing about generative AI is it's great at spreading information through translation to other languages, which means that partnered with some other tools like WhatsApp or other messaging services, you can target people in very specific areas with key messages. It would be a disaster, for instance, to have someone micro-target a specific language community in a key swing state in the United States, say Michigan or Florida. That's something that we're worried about. Another area that's related is micro-targeting when it comes to demographic information broadly. So rather than in a foreign language, this would be taking, for instance, publicly available precinct data that tells voters where they vote on election day, and pairs that with some basic phone numbers that you can purchase from any vendor, and then send people text messages that says something like, voting at Pace Auditorium is paused because of fire sprinklers. People are much more likely to believe information when it is coupled with something that they already know to be true, like, for instance, they know that they vote at Pace Auditorium. That's a risk because generating that content at a micro level is much easier with generative AI tools.
Do you detect any kind of course you probably do, but in terms of foreign influencing, it was a big story in 2016 elections, Russia now with wars, now with special stories, I don't know how much it motivates US voters. Migration as the biggest subject for you, not that much maybe Middle East, maybe it does, you know, concerning these huge topics that you have within the United States, migration and these international topics, what are the things that are there in this disinformation space and possible foreign influence?
Well, we see different trends. One is there has been a trend that has been made popular by Russia and a little bit by China, which is to seek to create polarizing content simply for the sake of creating polarizing content, because an angry electorate produces unpredictable outcomes in an election. Now, the content itself, I think, is less important, right? Sometimes that content is around things like major issues around, for instance, what you said, immigration or race relations or anything like that. But I think for the most part, those campaigns seek long-term gains from discrediting the United States through looking like it's in disarray. And that's a very common foreign interference tactic, is to kind of undermine a country by making it look messy. Separate from that, most, I think, of the worrisome disinformation campaigns that aren't seeking to just polarize the electorate are targeted at providing incorrect or counterfactual information about candidates, about the issues in an election, or how to vote itself. And voter suppression techniques are one that we're very worried about here at CDT.
We know that Trump as a concept is very much aligned with be it conspiracies, be it misinformation, disinformation, and that Biden is trying to position himself as this, you know, beacon of democracy, as opposition to all these things. What's going on in this battle? What do you detect at this point now, or before or after Super Tuesday? It doesn't matter, but in these 2024 elections, with two of them as figures in this information?
Well, in many ways, 2024 is a unique election because it is most likely to be a rerun of an exact election, the previous election campaign. It's not something we've seen too many times, and it is likely to mean that narratives that existed in the 2020 election will be rehashed. One of those major narratives that obviously impacted the United States for the last 4 years is the question about whether or not elections had the outcome that was intended. Now we know the answer. Elections have been thoroughly vetted and audited and recounted and verified in every way possible, and the outcome of the election is not in question, right? The election in 2020 was not rigged and was fairly administered. However, the big lie will be a big question in this election, and it's one that we think that disinformation and misinformation campaigns seek to utilize for their own benefit. Sometimes it's so that candidates can make claims that they won when they didn't. Sometimes it is to benefit other members of their political party, and sometimes it's simply to sow chaos. And it's hard to know what the intention is when those sorts of campaigns emerge, but we do know that they stand a chance of really harming voter confidence and people's willingness to engage in elections in general, unless we take action to bolster confidence in the integrity of elections.
Is it working? Because I saw the slogan, "Too big to rig," that Trump is putting out there. Is it working? Is it, is it possible to convince those who's standing up the street here in Madison voting for GOP on Sunday, a lady with a Trump hat who said, "I don't trust you, even though, I don't know, if I win, I trust, if I don't win, I will go on Capitol again"?
Look, this isn't new. For a lot of years, the thing that surveys tell us is the biggest factor in whether or not people think an election was rigged or not is whether or not their preferred candidate wins. That's hard to overcome, and it takes very concerted efforts. It takes outreach and education campaigns from the media, from journalists, from politicians and candidates. It takes civil society organizations actively conducting voter education campaigns and election officials creating materials to disprove and debunk mis and disinformation as it emerges. And it takes the social media platforms distributing authoritative information quickly to prevent its spread as it does. But if we do all those things, I think that there's a chance that we can prevent harm to our election this cycle.